La Asamblea General.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Robert Mugabe, President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Your Excellency, Mr. Morgens Lickenthoff, President of the 70th session of the General Assembly, Your Majesties, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, Your Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends. Allow me at the outset to extend to you, Mr. Lickenthoff, my warm congratulations on your election to the high office of President of the 70th session of the General Assembly. You assume this office at an historic moment when the United Nations has just adopted an ambitious agenda for the future of humankind. The task ahead needs all hands on the deck, and you can count on our cooperation and support during your presidency. Mr. President, I wish to commend Mr. Sam Kutesa, a distinguished son of Africa, for the dynamism with which he steered this august body over the past year. We particularly appreciated his leadership in promoting inclusive dialogue and seeking consensus on the many sensitive issues that he presided over during his tenure of office. The theme of this session, I quote, "The United Nations at 70th, the road ahead of peace, security, human rights," unquote, aptly complements the deliberations of the summit meeting on the post-2015 development agenda. It is our expectation that the United Nations will draw from its 7 decades-long experiences to give birth to a new era of peace, equality, and justice, a new era that recognizes and fosters the commonality of our common fate through renewed international cooperation and solidarity. Mr. President, the African Union welcomes the priorities you have proposed, for they are in tandem with our own developmental plan, the Agenda 2063, which recognizes the intrinsic and inextricable linkages between peace, security, development, and the full realization of human rights. The African Union Constitutive Act recognizes that while peace and security are imperative for our progress, conflict is a major impediment to the socio-economic advancement and integration of the continent. Consequently, the Common African Position on the post-2015 development agenda designates peace and security as one of its 6 key pillars and a top priority for us. The prevalence of peace not only creates conducive conditions for development, but also ensures that the maximum possible resource can be dedicated to development programs and projects. We welcome and encourage the continued cooperation between the United Nations and the African Union, principally through the latter's Peace and Security Council, in advancing peace and security in Africa. Mr. President, in January this year, the leaders of the African Union adopted Agenda 2063 as our continent's plan to accelerate deepened economic integration of our countries and regions. Its main objective is to improve the well-being of the continent's citizenry through sustained and balanced economic growth. At the African Union Summit in Pretoria, South Africa in June this year, we agreed on the agenda's first 10-year development plan. During these initial 10 years, the flagship programs will include the creation of a continental free trade area, the African Center for Disease Control, a Pan-Africa University of Science and Technology to develop skills for the value addition and beneficiation of the continent's vast mineral resources, a single aviation market, a high-speed train, and a Pan-African e-network. The successful implementation of Agenda 2063 calls not just for the commitment of African stakeholders, but also for the support and engagement of partners beyond the borders of our continent. Africa is not looking for handouts. Rather, it is looking for partners in massive infrastructural development, in creating and exploiting the value chains from the God-given natural resources, and in improving the quality of life of the continent's citizens. The entire world stands to benefit from an economically empowered African continent than from one emasculated by deprivation and with an over-dependence on others. Mr. President, adaptation to change is the most crucial ingredient for the vibrancy and effectiveness of any organization, including the United Nations. While the world has drastically changed since 1945, the United Nations and indeed the global governance architecture remains mired in a long bygone era. This archaic hierarchy among nations threatens to erode the confidence and support that the United Nations commands among the majority, but disadvantaged of its membership. We are disappointed that we have lost the opportunity of this anniversary to address this burning issue of the reform of the United Nations Security Council in a manner that satisfies the just demands and expectations of the majority among us. I wish to reiterate our strong attachment to Africa's common position on the reform of the Security Council contained in the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. I call on all genuine friends of Africa and all those who value justice, fairness, and democracy to support Africa's just and reasonable proposals. Mr. President, we equally call for the revitalization of the General Assembly, the sole universally representative and democratic organ of the United Nations, so that it can effectively carry out its charter-mandated responsibilities. Accordingly, we fully support the call for inclusivity and transparency in selecting our organization's Secretary General by ensuring that the General Assembly plays a more significant role in that process. After all, the Secretary General is at the service of all the member states, and not only that of an exclusive, privileged few. Mr. President, respecting and upholding human rights is the obligation of all states and is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Nowhere does the Charter arrogate the right to some to sit in judgment over others in carrying out this universal obligation. In that regard, we reject the politicization of this important issue and the application of double standards to victimize those who dare think and act independently of the self-anointed prefects of our time. We equally reject attempts to prescribe new rights that are contrary to our values, norms, traditions, and beliefs. We are not gays. Cooperation and respect for each other will advance the cause of human rights worldwide. Confrontation, vilification, and double standards will not. Mr. President, self-determination and independence are intrinsic and fundamental rights that should be enjoyed by all peoples everywhere without distinction. We are deeply concerned by the continued denial of this basic right to the Sahrawi people. We urge the United Nations to expeditiously finalize what must be done to conclude the decolonization of the Western Sahara. In the Middle East, the suffering of the Palestinian people continues unabated. What does Mr. Obama say about that? We reiterate our unwavering support to the just cause of the Palestinian people. Do we agree, Mr. United States? We also reiterate that lasting peace in the Middle East can only be achieved through negotiations to achieve a two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. We are concerned by the increased in tensions in that region and urge the United Nations to assume its responsibility and bring an end to this senseless conflict. Mr. President, the promotion of gender equality is critical for the realization of the post-2015 development agenda. The African Union designated 2015, I quote, the year of the advancement of women empowerment and development towards Agenda 2063, unquote, in order to mobilize our individual and collective actions around this key issue. Gender equality and women empowerment are central to the achievement of human development, progress, and the elimination of the scourge of poverty and deprivation. We must continue to build upon the achievements that have been realized since the 1995 Fourth United Nations Conference on Women and the Beijing Declaration and its platform for action. Mr. President, the growing list of phenomena that neither respect nor know any borders makes it imperative that we mobilize all mechanisms of cooperation to effectively overcome them. Terrorism and extremist violence, communicable diseases such as HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, bird flu, Ebola, cannot be overcome single-handedly. the United Nations and its specialized agencies is the place and the mechanism for this indispensable and necessary cooperation. For some months now, we have watched heartbreaking and harrowing scenes of desperate refugees seeking to enter Europe in search of safety and shelter from the ravages of conflict in their own homelands. We have also read of the tragedy and loss of life in the Mediterranean. The majority of the affected people are from Syria or from other countries devastated by conflict and instability induced in great part by the destabilization policies of external forces. This tragic situation could have been avoided through the respect of the independence of other countries and non-interference in their internal affairs. In the case of Libya, we are witnessing the results of abusing the authority of the United Nations Security Council and ignoring the opinion of regional organizations, in this instance, the African Union, which are supposed to be the United Nations partners in the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, my country, Zimbabwe, is committed to a fair, just, and effective United Nations in which multilateralism, inclusivity, and transparency replace unilateralism, exclusion, and backroom deals. The Charter of the United Nations is built on the bedrock of the sovereign equality and independence of its members, without distinction as to their geographical size, economic might, or any other endowments or qualifications. We are deeply attached to these principles and call on other members of the United Nations to be similarly disposed. The United Nations was set up, among other purposes, to, and I quote, develop friendly relations amongst millions, unquote. Zimbabwe desires and is committed to nurturing friendly relations with other nations, but it cannot tolerate interference in its domestic affairs. We invite other countries with which we may have differences, including the United States and the NATO powers. We invite them, if they have differences of whatever nature with us, to eschew threats, pressures, and punitive actions in favor of reconciliation, friendship, and dialogue. I therefore denounce in the strongest terms the illegal sanctions that are imposed on my country by the European Union and the USA, and call for their immediate and unconditional removal. We don't know what wrong we have done to the United States, and can it leave us free and independent to do our own thing, please? Once more, I put it on record that my country is desirous to live in harmony with all countries, big and small. We have peace in Zimbabwe just now. We don't want war. We don't want interference. We don't want to hear of regime change at all. The 70th anniversary of our organization has been marked, Mr. President, by the adoption of a far-reaching agenda which has the potential to drastically transform our world in all aspects. We are under no illusion about the challenges that lie ahead, but we are not discouraged either. Humankind has, over the epochs, demonstrated an immense tenacity in overcoming inertia and resistance to change. Now is our time to leave our own positive mark in the history of human development and interaction. Posterity, I repeat, expects no less from us. I thank you.